I believe we're going to have a very interesting discussion this afternoon because we have very interesting speakers, and also we're very fortunate to have here a delegation from the European Parliament, and also the chair of this delegation will also speak to us. We will start by asking the ambassador of the European Union, or the head of the delegation of the European Union. I'm sorry, on the invitation I did not have the proper title, Ambassador Andrew Staley, to speak to us. We will have a variety of subjects that we will discuss today, not only Israeli-European relations. We named it Europe and Israel. We'd like to learn about Europe from the ambassador of the European Union here, and to learn about what is happening in Europe itself. And later, perhaps, I understand that when Ambassador Shimon Shtein, who was the Israeli ambassador to Germany and is today a senior research fellow at the INSS, he will speak to us after Ambassador Staley, and I understand he will focus more on the relations between Europe and Israel, bring more the Israeli perspective into it. I will then, because they will only start with short opening statements, we will then hear the chair of the delegation from Europe, and afterwards I will present a few questions, and we can also open the floor for the public, for whoever wants to ask or make comments. So we are all about to have, I believe, an interesting afternoon. Ambassador Staley, please, the floor is yours.
Professor Shiftán, many, many thanks. It's really a pleasure to be here at Haifa University in the context of this event in connection with the celebration of Europe Day, and therefore many, many thanks to the Center for National Security Studies, to the Center for German and European Studies. And it's a particular honor to be here today in the presence of our colleagues and political mentors from the European Parliament, and in particular President or Chairman Bastian Bélder, the head of the delegation for relations with Israel of the European Parliament, and his colleague. And also a real pleasure to recognize in the audience my friend and colleague, the Ambassador of Denmark. And as you know, Denmark currently holds the rotating presidency of the European Union. So as Professor Shiftán suggested, or as he alluded, I will recognize the Ambassador of Malta, who has just joined us here. I would not really like to talk initially in these introductory remarks on EU-Israel relations. I just want to give some fairly personal remarks on Europe. This, as I said, is an event which is taking place in the context of the celebration of the beginning of EU integration, what we call Europe Day, on the 9th of May. And it's a moment for us to, in a way, look back, as birthdays often give us the occasion to do, while also looking ahead. So basically what I want to talk about briefly is achievements and challenges of the European Union. So, and I realize the time is short, so I'll try and be fairly brief and concise. Israel and the European Union, we more or less share the same birthday. We're running more or less the same age. Israel just celebrated its 64th birthday. We're now in the 62nd year of European integration, so we're growing older side by side. And as I said, 62 years since in Europe, Robert Schuman set in motion the process of European integration. And so, as I said before, this is a moment which I would like to take both to look back to some of the achievements and also to look forward to analyze some of the challenges that face us. And I think at this moment it's also important to get the balance right between achievements and challenges. Sometimes in a moment of particular difficulty and crisis, as I believe we are facing in Europe, it's too easy to lose sight of the significant achievements that we have recorded in the past. So I hope that we can get some good balance. So what are, in my opinion, and as I said, these are fairly personal remarks. I'm not reading from a prepared official text that's being given to me, but I'm giving, as a committed European, my personal impressions. What can we signal in terms of our achievements over the last 62 years? Well, for me, the first and obvious conclusion is that the countries of the European Union have succeeded in living in peace together. And the basic goal that was set by the founders of European integration, which was to prevent further war among the nations of Europe, has been successfully achieved. Obviously, there have been some terrible conflicts since in the European continent in geographic terms, and in particular in the Western Balkans, but there have not been armed conflicts between members of the European Union. National interests continue to compete, obviously, but the ability of the European Union and its institutions to provide an effective mechanism to resolve such conflicts peacefully and in the common interest has been demonstrated successfully time after time. Now, I'm aware that, as the expression goes, never is a very long time. But I think we have some reason now to hope that we will never again have war among European nations which are integrated together. And in any event, that must continue to be our fundamental goal. Now, at the same time, the European Union has sought to be consistent in defense and promotion of its basic values of democracy and the protection of human rights. The EU has never been primarily a geographic construction, and even less one based on a common religion. What it has been is an integration of countries based on a shared commitment to universal values. This will always remain the EU's fundamental characteristic. And the peace which has been achieved has been based on interdependence. Paradoxical as it may seem, the security of each country has increased in proportion to the degree of interdependence that exists between it and its potential rivals. This mutual vulnerability, if you want to put it that way, is the basic proposition underlying Schumann's proposal in May 1950 to place the French and German steel and coal industries, the core in those days of their military industrial complexes, under a supranational authority. Because the more closely integrated and interdependent two or more countries are, the more improbable it is that it will be in the interest of any of them to attack or to dominate the others. Now, interdependence naturally requires compromises and trade-offs, and the institutional architecture of the European Union, with all of its complexity, is essentially designed to maximize the chances that the common interest can be found and promoted. In my opinion, the EU's next most profound achievement after peace and its commitment to its values has been its enlargement. The process of extending across the entire European continent a zone of stability and peace, while not yet complete, has proceeded in a way that I imagine goes well beyond the wildest dreams of Schuman and others in 1950. The reunification of the European continent following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rapid transformation of the USSR's former satellite countries into open democracies and free market economies could not have happened so smoothly in the absence of the European Union. The enlargement of the European Union continues. Croatia will very soon become the 28th member state, and Serbia recently joined the ranks of candidate countries alongside Turkey, Montenegro, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, and Iceland. Now, closely associated with peace and enlargement, we must mention among the fundamental achievements of the EU its nearly constant economic growth. From the war-shattered economies of the 1940s emerged an ever more integrated and prosperous European market. Basic needs initially had to be satisfied, and one of the EU's earliest policies, the common agricultural policy, often much maligned nowadays, served to ensure steady supplies of foodstuffs to consumers at stable prices while also ensuring a decent living for farmers. Now, the economic integration of the European Union is also a work in progress. While the current situation clouds its success, the creation of the euro was a spectacular step forward. We now know that important reforms are needed to ensure its continued success, but the significance of creating a common monetary zone comprising now 17 countries should not be overlooked. The next achievement that I would like to mention is its promotion of multilateralism in world affairs. This is an obvious and natural extension of how we are organized in Europe. If we believe that cooperation managed by supranational bodies is good for European countries, so we also believe that the same general approach can benefit the wider international community. The EU has therefore always argued for a strong multilateral world order based on clear rules with the United Nations at its center. And this belief has only grown with time as our awareness of the interrelationship of global problems has increased. Many of the key challenges that we face are beyond the scope of a single country to address, whether this be climate change, international migration, terrorism, global financial stability, and so on. It is only at the multilateral level that these challenges can be addressed effectively. The EU can therefore look back with satisfaction over the past decades at the systematic support it has given to strengthening a strong international system. The EU, in this context, has long been the leading advocate for transparent, rules-based international order. It has devoted great energy to being at the forefront of international negotiations to find global solutions to global problems. EU leadership is well established in climate change and international trade negotiations, to name but two key ongoing endeavors. And so the EU has logically emerged as a key normative force in the international community. We need clear rules to ensure that our own internal EU system functions effectively, and it is also in the common interest that there be clear rules at the wider international level. And finally, to conclude this brief review of what have been the landmark developments and achievements of the European Union over its first 62 years, I'd like to come to the EU as a global player. The EU was long described as an economic giant, but a political pygmy, and its giant status in economic terms reflected the growth of the EU becoming the world's largest integrated economic bloc and the largest trading partner, accounting now for 20% of all international trade. But the EU's rather less spectacular role on the political stage reflected the fact that the first decades of European integration had indeed a sharp focus on the economic dimension. It was only in the 1970s that the EU started to be organized in a way to allow it to be more active in international political and security matters. For years, the EU's role in international political and security, the EU's role in international political affairs was limited to that of being a payer, exemplified by its role as the largest donor of aid to developing countries, but the EU was rather less of a player. That has now changed over the last decades, and the conflicts in the Middle East were one of the issues around which closer political cooperation at the EU level developed in the 1970s. And more significantly, since the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty 2 years ago, the way the EU engages in international diplomacy and security affairs has been revamped. The EU's changing role and increased intervention in international security matters can be seen in the growth in the number of what we call the European Union's common security and defense policy missions. These are missions to assist in maintaining stability in fragile zones in the world, and to assist in the re-establishment of the rule of law in areas marked by conflict and war. EU missions can be civilian in their nature or military. Close to 25 such missions in Africa, the Middle East, the Balkans, and Asia, involving thousands of personnel, are either ongoing or have been completed. And these have included, in this region, EU Polcops, supporting the training and professionalization of the Palestinian Authority's police force, as well as EU BAM, that was stationed at the Rafah crossing point following Israel's disengagement from Gaza. These, then, in my view, are the Union's signal achievements since its foundation. They're not presented with any sentiment of smugness, for we're only too aware of the imperfections that have marked the process of integration over the years, and much more remains to be done. But at the same time, I believe that we can justifiably feel considerable satisfaction at what has been achieved. And yet, the challenges that lie ahead are formidable, and let us look at some of them very briefly. The first you may expect me to say is economic, and we'll certainly come to that in a moment. But allow me to express my personal view that even more important, we must successfully overcome any challenge that may arise to our fundamental values. More basic to our future than economic prosperity is our protection of our identity as an open, tolerant society promoting and safeguarding values of democracy, equality, and respect for human rights, particularly in times of economic uncertainty and hardship, when the dangers of populism are all too apparent. Vigilance with regard to our core values is of utmost importance. In this regard, finding the right answers to the questions of changing identities or of multiculturalism remains a great challenge. And I deliberately place this issue on the table immediately after putting before you the question of values, because I'm convinced that it is in this context of our basic values that we can ensure that the changing composition of many European societies can be harmoniously managed. We know that the demographic composition of Europe is changing with regard to ethnicity and religion. Some see this as a threat, fueling the populism that I mentioned a minute ago. But all citizens should be free to identify themselves in the way that they choose, as long as they are respectful of core universal values. Now, it is true that Europe's homogeneity in ethnic and religious terms is increasingly replaced by diversity, but this should surely be a source of richness and opportunity rather than a cause of intolerance and exclusion. Now, the economic and financial situation is clearly of profound concern. I think that we now have a clearer understanding of the root causes of the situation that was allowed to develop under our noses without appropriate action being taken. At the heart of it was a growing lack of competitiveness, whose full effect was hidden by profligate management of public and private finances that was in turn made possible by inadequate supervision and oversight. So many measures have already been taken to stabilize the situation and to prevent further occurrences. Oversight of national budgets and of key financial markets has been strengthened. Bailout funds have restored a measure of stability to the financial sector and steadied public finances in the most affected countries. The latest data show improvements with regard to public finances. The worrying news concerns slow growth and poor employment data. Yet the major challenge of reducing excessive sovereign debt and budget deficits on the one hand, while at the same time creating conditions for renewed growth and employment on the other hand, remains before us. Cutting government expenditure reduces debt levels and deficits, but worsens the prospects for growth and employment. On the other hand, stimulating the economy creates jobs, but deepens debts and deficits. Policymakers are having to face this quandary, but what seems very clear is that the political resolve and will to find a way forward exist. I again express a personal view in maintaining that the euro, for all of the flaws that have become apparent in the last couple of years, remains a fundamental achievement of European integration that contributed to growth and efficiency in the eurozone and beyond. But it's equally clear that if Europe is to maintain the leading role that it plays and should continue to play in the world, its economy must be placed on a surer footing. A further challenge before us is demographic. We are an aging and in many cases diminishing population in the European Union. We can look with some envy at Israel's demographic trends, although they too contain issues that will be challenging to address, as we in Europe face the prospect of a population that over the next 50 years will increase by just 2%, while the population aged 65 years and over will increase from 17% of the total population in 2008 to 30% in 2060. And just to add one further concern, the old age dependency ratio, the number of active workers per retired person, will decrease from 4 in 2008 to less than 2 in 2060. So this in turn leads us to the question of migration. The demographics are clear. We will need more people, younger people. Many will have to come from outside the European Union through a process of managed migration. Otherwise, our social security system will not be sustainable, and a pillar of our welfare system, a foundation of our social market economy, will be lost. But more migration means possibly exacerbating populist tensions that accompany the debate on multiculturalism and will therefore require careful political preparation. Now, as the reactions to the euro crisis have shown, a further challenge facing the European Union will be whether the fundamental political decisions affecting the Union's future will be taken through a process of intergovernmental consultation and coordination, or whether what we call the community method will continue to be the norm. This is far from being just an academic point. It concerns how the common interest that I mentioned earlier is identified and shaped. The community method, in which policies are shaped through all member states' participation in the EU institutional framework, with give and take and mutual compromise and concessions between all, may be laborious, but it ensures that all member countries feel that their interests are taken into account. The intergovernmental approach, on the other hand, can lead to key policies being shaped outside the EU framework. And if the EU is to continue to be strong and viable, all member countries should contribute to the formulation of common policies. In conclusion, looking back 62 years, we can see profound achievements, while major challenges lie ahead, possibly some of the greatest since the start of European integration in 1950. Although not all would agree, there are many, and I include myself among them, who believe that when European integration has faltered, it is usually because we have stepped back from deeper integration. Our prosperity is best served by ensuring that the common European interest is identified and promoted. This requires strong institutions to exercise leadership and oversight. The lessons of the euro crisis bear this out. The balance between retaining national sovereignty and ceding part of it to the supranational level will always be a matter of the utmost political sensitivity. However, if we are to be inspired by the crowning achievement of the past 62 years in Europe, the maintenance of peace, then I believe that the way forward is clear. Thank you very much.
Good day to all of you. I want to thank the University of Haifa and the two centers for inviting me to mark the occasion. I want to thank Ambassador Sטנדלי for his introductory remarks, which were comprehensive and yet succinct. I've taken note of some of the code words that you have addressed, and I'm sure that we will be able to discuss them later on. I have not prepared a written text, so I will simply make some observations. I see in the room a combination of experienced and young people together. I have been dealing with the European Union for almost 40 years, so I claim to have a certain perspective. And I guess as we go along, perhaps we could share some of it, reflect, and have a discussion. Because sometimes we should take the opportunity in the privacy of this room and go beyond the generalizations describing relationship and see where is the convergence, where are the divergence. Because if you were to talk to an Israeli, be it an official or not only a tourist, then and will ask him what do we associate when we say Europe. So beyond the tourism, I think that if I reflect on the current situation, so one would think of troubled relationship, anti-Semitism, lot of disappointments, bitterness, anger, at the same time of growing volume of personal network, increasing trade. So the picture that presents itself is, to be on the positive side, a mixed bag of Europe-Israeli relationship. I hasten to say that in speaking about Europe, whenever I will mention Europe, I mean the European Union and not those countries beyond, which are perhaps geographically part of Europe, but do not belong to that privileged club. And since Ambassador Sטנדלי took the opportunity in marking the 62nd anniversary of the Day of Europe and looked back, I will also try and perhaps look back and try and find few common things between the creation of the European Union currently and the State of Israel. Then I would look, as I'm a student of history and a practitioner for 32 years, I would look at the interests and see where we converge, as I said, and where we diverge. Starting with history, I think that what's interesting to note is the establishment, the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 and the idea of Europe are both a product of learning the lesson of history. With the creation of the State of Israel, which came at the end of the beginning of a long process which goes back to the 19th century, again in Europe, the founding of the Zionist movement, going through the growing recognition about the need for a self-determination for the Jewish people as a collective, not as individuals, going through the 19th century and then the 20th century with the major catastrophe of the Holocaust and the Second World War, which clearly was not the reason for the creation of the State of Israel, as some would claim, but a catalysator which finally led to the recognition and the establishment of the state in 1948. Well, Europe, without that catastrophe, I wonder whether we would have come so far in seeing the European countries, and first and foremost France and Germany, and with the personalities. The ambassador mentioned Robert Schuman, but he's one of quite a number of great statesmen who understood that based on the lessons that have brought to that catastrophe, by the way, it's the second one, the first one, which was also a major turn in history, the First World War, Robert Schuman, de Gasperi, and Konrad Adenauer, to mention only the three of them, that in order to learn something from history, if one can ever learn from history, you have to look forward and jump beyond your historic shadow towards creating something new. And as I said, I mean, that was the beginning with the coal and steel, which ultimately then led to the European communities and now to the European Union. So both Israel and the European Union are an historic product. Not only that, the two of them present a paradigm change of history. I belong to those who believe that without a catastrophe and an historic leadership, when it matches together, as was the case after the Second World War, you have the creation of the European Union and also the creation of the State of Israel, which, by the way, one cannot remain without current politics. I guess even as far as Israel nowadays is concerned, I hope that we will not need another catastrophe and that we will hopefully be able to have an historic leadership which will recognize the moment and take those historic decisions that we all are looking for. So it is the paradigm change which both Israel and the European Union also presents. Touching simply also on a remark that Ambassador has made, which is not relevant to the European Israeli, but more to the European Union, as it is currently going through what I believe is an existential crisis, is whether the model of integration has reached its limits, or whether it is not yet the case, something which many European members are grappling with, as we also know and follow the discussion about the other term that the ambassador has mentioned, and that is European identity. I, frankly, Ambassador, don't know what a European identity means. Eventually, we will be able to speak about the European identity, as, by the way, I don't know what is an Israeli identity in the State of Israel, which is also a process that is evolving, and we may ultimately be in a position to define what is it that makes a European identity, or for that matter, an Israeli identity. European and Israeli relationship are loaded with history. I guess it would be a mistake to deal with only current politics without understanding that in our dialogue with the Europeans, we are bringing with us an historical baggage that sometimes can be an asset and sometimes can be a liability. And that mix is sometimes also a problem. The Europeans are also bringing to the dialogue with us a lot of history. And as I said, that in itself, too much history is too much. And therefore, we have to find a way to have the history at the background, but also looking forward. In terms of the creation of the State of Israel surrounded by enemies, I think that Israel was among the first countries that has recognized the European communities at the time. Again, also out of a certain constraint that we had, all of us know the history and know that we were surrounded, or still are surrounded by enemies, and therefore you look for other partners, friends, wherever you can find them. It is not always that we have found our friends in Europe, but they finally emerged as our partners, and I would venture to say that they have to be inevitably, as far as the future of the State of Israel, a strategic partner. Whether the Europeans look at it as we would like, as I personally would like, is another issue, but Europe will remain for the foreseeable future a hinterland as far as we are concerned, and I'll come to it in a minute in speaking about the interest. So we have Israel seeking, looking out, reaching out beyond its immediate borders for friends, and Europe presents itself, because also of history, geography, also as a possible friend, partner. Let me then move briefly and try and, first of all, identify the European interest in Israel, and then speak about the Israeli interest in Europe. When I start, and I have a few telegraphic remarks to make. First of all, history. As I said, there is a lot of guilty conscience in Europe about the Holocaust, the European role in making that happen. And therefore, for a very long time, though we do not speak about it, but it hovers away, and without understanding part of that political culture and the background, one has a difficulty in conducting a dialogue with the European, which, when it is not very superficial, has to dig a bit more beyond below the ground in order to see what are the undercurrents that are going. And as I said, there is a lot of history. There is a lot of, at the beginning, of looking at the victim and the perpetrators. Over the years, we are no longer considered, perceived by many Europeans as the victims. That role has been taken by the Palestinians, and we have sometimes difficult to realize that we are no longer have a privileged status of still being a victim, as some of us would like to see us forever. So, I mean, that is something that historic dimension has to be seen in the context as one interest, and also something that the Europeans take into account when talking to us politically. The ambassador has already referred to the European Union since introducing the European political cooperation in the late 60s and then beginning of the 70s. The two items that the Europeans chose to devote their attention in the realm of foreign policy were, at that time, you will recall, the CSCE and the Middle East. In a way, the unfolding crisis, the never-ending crisis, the intractable one, in a way, helps the European and contributes to shaping their common foreign policy. And it has been a subject over which the Europeans have found themselves together in a kind of a lowest common denominator and spoke in one voice, as they have done that on more occasions than on almost any other issue, especially in international forums. And political dimension in Israel, after all, it's part of 50% of the unresolved Arab-Israeli-Palestinian problem. So obviously there is a high degree of interest in interacting with the Israelis and trying to help together with them to have the Europeans also assist in trying to resolve the problem. Economically, though, it's numerically a tiny market, but nevertheless, 25th on the list of the countries in the world that the EU maintains very close economic relationship with us, and I guess we take a very high percentage of the overall trade balance that the European Union has with the Middle East by and large. Notwithstanding the oil dimension. Then you have the technological research, and I guess here is something which is example when the Europeans really have an interest, they know somehow to overlook the political difficulties and have the Israelis actively participating in a program as the only non-EU member state, which Israel is a member of that now 8th program almost. So whenever there is an interest, the European can disregard their political misgivings about Israeli behavior, but there's certainly a clear understanding that Israel is a superpower in terms of technology and science, and therefore a high interest and a European interest in having close relationship with the community. Culture as well, I guess, there are historical roots among the European countries which they help to cultivate and deepen. When it comes to democracy and though the value issue, the value thing, as somebody has said, well, I do have really problems with the community of values and democracy. And I think over that issue, we should really enter into a more deeper dialogue. What do we really mean when we speak about those common and shared values? I think that even within the European Union, speaking about common values, I just had a visit to Budapest, Hungary, and in speaking of common values and democracy and separation of, Ambassador, you are also overlooking within the European Union and shying away from taking some of your members to task over their understanding of what democracy means. So I guess, that is something which we have a deficit, and we will have to perhaps dwell into it and iron out whether there are some commonalities. We certainly would like to see us as members of that joint community. The problem is that there are some Europeans who, because of the way we behave, do not see us as part of the community, as part of the broader community, which is framed nowadays also as the West, generally speaking. So, but nevertheless, I guess the democracy aspect is also an interest and shared values that makes it for the Europeans to have a keen interest in Israel. So it's a mixed bag when we speak about the European interest in Israel. What about the interest, the Israeli interest in Europe? And here again, if I take the same terminologies, I think that history plays here also a very critical role as far as Israel is concerned. In terms of politics, I guess the United States remains for Israel for the future the sole guarantor and our prime partner, with some second thoughts and some reservations about the European Union, about the trustworthiness of the European Union. So I guess as far as politics, you will hear some Israelis who will belittle and downplay the role of the European Union. I do not belong to them. I think that as I said, see the European Union as a strategic partner, and I would like to find ways to identify, as we look into the future, areas of commonality where we have joint interests that we can pursue together in looking towards the 21st century with all the difficulties. I think that economically, as I said, the European Union, even if we were to have a peaceful relationship with our immediate neighborhood, it will be years from now when those will be our markets, and we will still, as a high-tech and advanced society and economy, we will have to look to the 500 million European market as our strategic hinterland. That goes also for the technological and scientific dimensions that are also highly placed on our agenda with Europe. About culture, about tourism, I guess many Israelis discovered their roots again and consider Europe, not to speak about the growing number, which I see as quite problematic, of Israelis also getting EU passports and making those countries also part of their private identity, always with the pretext of convenience and what have you, which I consider to be a bit problematic. So I think that those are the things, the way I see it. As we move on, there's, as far as EU-Israel relationship, of course, the instruments that you need to carry out policies, and we have the bilateral. I will not go over the progress that we have made over time in enhancing our relationship with the European Union, with the known deficit that we can discuss them. And the multilateral instruments, and those are mainly the Mediterranean instruments, which Israel has become also an integral part of, though the Europeans do not know how to digest it, especially now in the wake of the so-called Arab Spring, where the Europeans will have to reconsider and think it over, whether the instruments that have so far not been very successful with Israel, whether they will also be also the instruments for the future in addressing the huge challenges that are lying in front of us. I think then that I'll stop here, and thanks a lot for your attention.
Let me invite now a member of the European Parliament, Bastian Belder, the chair of the Delegation of Relations with Israel. Will you please come up here and...
Dear Professor Shiftán, thank you very much on behalf of my delegation of the European Parliament to be here for a short while. Your guest, I'm an historian also by profession, so it is quite stimulating what I learned this afternoon from our dear ambassador, Mr. Sטנדלי, and the former ambassador to Germany of the State of Israel. I know him by his writings. I think this is a good sign, for I must say, I feel quite at home here because although I'm a politician now by profession since 1999, the first thing I do every day is to look at the websites of Israeli academic institutions if they have something to say that I can learn as a European and as a Dutch member of the European Parliament. So, thanks again. Ladies and gentlemen, don't be afraid. It is usual in the European Parliament that we have speaking time for 1 minute or 2 minutes, and that is when we are hammered out. Dear ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the delegation of the European Parliament for the relations with the State of Israel, I express my sincere and warm greetings to you all, especially to the staff and the students of the University of Haifa. It is surely a privilege and pleasure to address you shortly. On this Europe Day, I want to grasp the opportunity to underline the great importance of Israel, of you as Israeli citizens, for Europe, for our continent. Our shared, painful history, and Ambassador Sטייין spoke shortly about it, speaks for itself. I would say, let us continue to reflect deeply on it together. This week is the commemoration of the liberation of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the 5th of May, and the day before we commemorate all the victims of our 5 years of occupation. And as an historian, as a citizen of the Netherlands, I can say to you that it is still often an emotional struggle what happened then also to our Jewish compatriots in these years. I had the fortune to be born in 1946. But when you are studying, and I'm now growing older, the debate is going on for, of course, we had also a lot of bystanders, and what was their role, and how was it possible that such a large segment of our Jewish co-citizens were deported and perished, and also what happened to the remnants, what happens to the survivors. So, and I think, and now speaking on Netherlands, it is in all the member states of European Union. You can't escape history, you should face it, but let us do it especially together. Especially to honor all the people that lived through these years. At the same time, our shared present asks for strong mutual cooperation. Therefore, we need especially the bright, open mind of Israeli citizens, especially scholars and students. The members of my delegation, I should underline, enjoy always the frank and honest discussions here with our Israeli counterparts. Let us defend together, and our ambassador already spoke about this, let us defend together spiritual freedom, for it enriches human dignity, human capital. Some years ago, a German journalist in the Süddeutsche Zeitung wrote a commentary. No, I must correct myself. It was a laudatio on the many miracles of the young state of Israel. I must also confess, it is a rare example in European press, but it was a special example, a laudatio on the miracles of the state of Israel. Our delegation hopes for more Israeli miracles, especially the miracle of peace with all your neighbors. That the state of Israel, that you as its future, may be a light for the nations surrounding you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Belder. Let me just apologize for the members of the European Parliament delegation. They will have to leave early here, so when they leave en masse, it is not because they disagree with everything we've said here, but simply because they have to be in Tel Aviv and meet other Israelis, and perhaps find among them the one that will make the miracle. I'm delighted that the issue of peace was associated here with miracles and with the Messiah, so we don't have to deal with it until the Messiah comes, or comes again, whatever you want, but we will wait and I'm sure. But we all agree we need a miracle. I'm delighted that the two speakers that spoke to me before this meeting did not live up to their commitments. They all said we will make very short statements and then we will discuss the issue at length. We got two very comprehensive presentations and enlightening as far as I'm concerned. I found them very interesting. And a lot of the things that I thought about bringing up as a discussion were already discussed. So let me, instead of presenting a number of questions and get everybody's answer on the subject, let me just bring two families of questions, and then each of the speakers will find among them what he wants to address. And I would like to start with the problematic element of European-Israeli relations so that we can end on a positive note. And I would ask you to refer, if you're interested, first of all to the question if there is something structural in the difficulties that we're having in the relations between Europe and Israel. You both admitted that there are difficulties, or we call them challenges when we don't want to call them by the proper name, so we call them challenges. So we've admitted that they are. The question is, are they structural, or is it just because Israel has the wrong government and in Europe maybe somebody made a statement he should not have made? Is it structural, or is it just something that we can easily correct? I would be very interested in comments concerning the difference between the attitude of individual European governments and the attitude of the European community. Some Israelis, I mean the not nice guys, people like me, will say that the European governments are by and large either friendly or fair-minded with a few exceptions, And when it comes to the attitudes of the European Union, it is, if I may use a diplomatic word that I never use, problematic. Another thing that I find fascinating is the tremendous difference between most of the governments, or at least many of the governments in Europe, and the attitude of the educated public opinion. It used to be in the 1950s and the 1960s that governments were unfriendly and public opinion was very friendly, and Israel used to mobilize public opinion in order to moderate the attitude of the governments. I think it's now in the other direction. And last but not least, the elephant that we all care not to mention very much, the elephant in the room of the rise of anti-Semitic elements. Is it as bad as some of us see, or are we all just paranoid? And now to the positive question, so that we can end on a positive note. What do you think, both of you, are the opportunities that Israelis and Europeans are not using? How can we improve the relationship? And what are we doing wrong? What can each of the parties contribute for an even better relations between Israel and Europe that exists today? So pick whatever you find interesting to comment on, or anything else you would like to comment on. And may I give the floor again to Ambassador Sטנדלי.
I mean, it would also be very interesting for me to know whether there's any hot questions out among the public which have not been covered by the long list that Professor Shiftán. No, because I think for me, one of the great aspects of today's event is the possibility really to have a conversation with you, the audience. But certainly I think the list of questions that has been put here, and I know the time is not so long, but if there are any questions from you, I mean, I would be very, very happy to hear those and to engage in a conversation there. Well, first of all, when I spoke, I didn't talk about challenges in EU-Israel relations. Instead, I talked about challenges facing the EU. But look, I mean, it's obviously, we have a very close relationship, the European Union and Israel, as Ambassador Shtein has also described very clearly in his remarks. We also have a relationship which is very structured. In fact, just yesterday, and I'm looking at my colleagues who are in the audience here, we had a meeting of what we call the EU-Israel Association Committee, which is the highest senior official level committee that reviews a whole range of EU relations, just below the level of what we call the Association Council, which is a political level body. But so yesterday we had the opportunity in a meeting that lasted all day in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Jerusalem to go through the whole range of EU-Israel relations. And it was very much in the context of what is indeed an element which is frequently cited by our Israeli friends and counterparts of the desire, which we both share, of wanting to deepen relations, but also understanding that that deepening of relations is not something that exists in an abstract way. It also takes place in a specific political context. And our position, and we have, I think, one of the most remarkably open dialogues that we can imagine with Israel compared to the kind of dialogue that we have with other partner countries. Certainly the discussions and the quality of the dialogue is extremely open with Israel. And so all of the issues are out there on the table. And certainly we've heard of frustrations which are felt maybe in both directions in terms of how to take that relationship forward. But I think, first of all, the important thing to emphasize is that if we're having those kinds of discussions, if we feel elements of frustrations because we would like to go further, but for whatever reason there are impediments which make it difficult for us to move further right now, it's also fundamentally based on the recognition that there's a great potential for further deepening the relations, which means that there's a real recognition of the complementarity that it exists between the European and Israel in the many areas that Ambassador Shtein has mentioned. And I think that's something that we should really always keep very firmly hold of. Now, the elephant, I see the other elephant, and maybe we have a herd of elephants here, but I mean the elephant, and I always like to speak as openly and freely as possible, which is in the path of the deepening or preventing the deepening of relations, is the clearly expressed position of the European Union that that deepening has to take place in a context of positive developments in regional issues which are of shared interest to Europe and to Israel, and specifically the Middle East peace process. Now, I know that it can be perceived as if we, the European Union, placing the entire burden of positive movement on the peace process onto Israel. Whereas we all know that this is not a conflict which only has one party. If we're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there clearly are two parties involved in this conflict. The solution to the conflict must come through negotiations which are successfully achieved and concluded between the two sides. And I want to assure you that we don't have such a simplistic view where pressure is only put on Israel. We only deny Israel the benefit or the potential benefit of a deepening of relations because of what we feel is a lack of progress in the peace process. We engage extremely deeply and constantly as well with the Palestinian side. But certainly this is an issue which is there, and I think we all believe and are convinced that when conditions allow, that natural complementarity that exists between the European Union and Israel can be fully or much more fully exploited to the mutual benefit. A reference was made earlier that when we see the mutual interest from a European perspective, for example, in the field of scientific cooperation, we engage. I mean, that may be a slightly harsh way to present, how we in the European side view this, because we engage in many other areas and sometimes not necessarily where it's so evident to the European interest. But there is no doubt that that's another illustration of the vast potential that remains to be exploited in deepening EU-Israel relations. Now, I mean, I don't want to take the microphone for too long, but you've also, and I very much recognize also that there's some colleagues of mine, ambassadors representing individual member states. I don't know whether they want to address your second question, which was the issue of attitude of individual member states vis-a-vis the attitude of the EU as a whole. But I mean, the only comment I would like to make is, and it refers back to the issue that has been touched upon already, which is the fact that since the 1970s, the European Union has been engaging very constantly on the issue of the Arab-Israeli or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we've had a very clear consistency of positions which have been adopted always by unanimous vote of the European Union member states, because these kinds of statements can only be adopted if all the member states sign up to them. And I think one of the things which is often under-recognized is, without me trying to claim that we have any visionary dimension or that our crystal ball is absolutely clear, but if you look at the positions that the European Union has taken, including some very important statements from the 1980s onwards, which have been in a way landmarks of positions defined by the European Union, again, unanimously, with regard to how we think that the way forward could be found to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian or the Israeli-Arab conflict, that those positions, which when they were first expressed, were often very harshly received by Israel, by other observers, as not being based in real understandings of the situation. But most of those positions, and I think Professor Shtein is much more of an expert as a researcher, as a very experienced Israeli ambassador, as a historian, whether in fact all of those positions have over time become the mainstream positions of the international community, and indeed form the basis of what everybody believes would be the parameters or the solutions to overcome the conflict. So I think it's important when there's a tendency sometimes to say, well, the EU takes tough positions with regard to Israel on this issue, while member states maybe are more accommodating. I think that's maybe a simplification, because at the end of the day, the policies of the European Union are made by the member states. They are unanimous in having approved some fundamental positions which have remained our constant view with regard to key elements of the EU-Israel relationship, and I think that continues to be the case. So I know I haven't answered all the questions, but I don't think it's my job to answer all the questions. So.
Well, I wish I could respond and also go beyond that, because each and every question that you, Dan, has posed to us merits a day-long seminar, and I wish that in the framing of the center here and the Your Center with the European Union, we will perhaps at one later point in the future take more than an hour and a half in order to delve into the issues that have been raised by Dan, including your last remark about the interplay between the bilateral and the common European. And there is a kind of an interplay between that speaking on behalf of the European Union and then speaking as a bilateral there are still differences between the national positions and the European position as far as Israel is concerned and as far as the Middle East, and even beyond that. And I think that there is a growing ceding of sovereignty, if you want, especially in delegating from the national to the level of the European Union, of positions which finally culminate in the European position at the United Nations and elsewhere. I would say whenever the Europeans feel comfortable, they speak in one voice, and wherever not, they always say, but we have a national position, so you are kind of left puzzled which one to adopt, but I will leave that point. The question that was asked by Dan, whether the problems are structural or conjunctural, I would say that in the privacy of this auditorium, there are some structural problems that one should not overlook. So there are certain limits to what we finally can agree upon. On the way here, I called a friend of mine and asked him to translate a saying in Hebrew quotation, which I guess is also in English elsewhere, which says in Hebrew, Adam hu tavnit nof moladeto, which in English I would say a man is a reflection of his homeland scenery. What do I mean by that? I mean, we are 64 years of age. For a person like myself, born in 48, I'm already an old person. For a state, it's rather a young one, and 64 years are a footnote sometimes, and even by historians sometimes even not that when you look at processes in an historic perspective. The 64 years that the state of Israel has had to go, and the 62 years that the European community, as all of us, brought us a different point because of the circumstances. So sometimes, and that was the feeling I came away after 7 relatively frustrating years, 2000, 2007, when I had the pleasure of serving as an ambassador to Germany, I came away with the conclusion, which is kind on a sober note and a sad one, that when we feel that we conduct a dialogue, we, as a matter of fact, are conducting monologues. The fact that we use the same terms doesn't mean that we share the same background when we speak about it. So our collective identity or experience in the last 64 years and the European 62 years have led to different conclusions and meanings when we say something about security, existential, asymmetry, excessive use of force, international law, whatever words that we took, they are controversial between us and the Europeans, and I'm afraid that they will stay so for quite some time, and there is no need to gloss over it, because the differences in politics are sometimes have to be seen in context, but is something a bit more fundamental that I'm afraid that we have a difficulty in overcoming it. So I have simply mapped a kind of a list of fundamental disagreements that we ought to live with them, discuss perhaps them, and find ways, notwithstanding them, to identify some practical objectives where we can walk a certain way together. And I think that the challenges of the 21st century around the term globalization offer us quite a host of practical ideas on which we can simply get an understanding that while going together we serve mutual interests, agreeing that we disagree. And I mean, the recognition that we cannot agree on every issue is something which is quite important. I mean, it starts with different expectations out of the relationship. The ambassador has already caveated how much the Europeans are willing to go with Israel, because by introducing the magic words of in the context of the political process, we already know that there is a huge constraint. So assuming that the current Israeli government, to be on a practical, will continue to stick to its ideas, and the European Union will also do so. So we are in for a very bumpy years ahead. So I guess those are differences that are almost insurmountable. The expectations are different, and I think that we can neither meet the European expectations, nor can the European meet their expectations as far as we are concerned. So you are in a way also blocked. Take the European role in the Middle East as a practical one. I think we see certain limits, because many Israelis believe that the Europeans are biased. And there has been, I mean, since time immemorial as a practitioner, we always spoke that there is not an even-handedness in perceiving the Middle East process and conflict and the ideas. And by the way, Ambassador, I wholeheartedly agree with your remarks. The Europeans were far ahead of us in envisaging ideas that took a while to materialize before they became household, like self-determination, statehood, and even going a step further, speaking about were we to resolve our conflict with the Palestinians in two-state solution, that Jerusalem will have to be divided. I mean, at last, as far as I'm concerned, there is no way to do it otherwise. The Europeans have been talking about it for quite some time, and we totally, as officials, have disagreed with them. Well, just wait and see whether, at the end of the day, our will prevail, Jerusalem is still a united, undivided, whatever, or the European one. The issue of the use of force, over which there are some ideological differences, and I don't know how we can overcome and surmount it. I mean, the notion of controversial, which also symptomatic, the creation of the wall fence. I mean, for us, it was a measure of protection, of security. For the Europeans, it was something totally else. It was a clear violation, as by the way the settlements are, of international law. And for the government of Israel, constructing new house units in Jerusalem is part of our understanding that Jerusalem has been annexed and is one and united, and therefore it's quite natural for us to do whatever we feel that we do in Tel Aviv, Haifa, whatever. I think that earlier I already took some issue, and I think that we have to really flesh out what is it that when we speak about shared values and commitment to democracy, whether we understand the same things under shared values. And I'm not so sure about it. I think that going on as to the issues which will determine the outcome of the conflict, I mean, we disagree on almost every issue that pertains to the outstanding issues that are on the agenda. Security, on borders, on Jerusalem, on refugees, on the nature of the state of Israel. I mean, there is no European position that goes as far as we would like as the conditions that we set on the Palestinian, in fact, a precondition which I believe is a mistake, in terms of you have to recognize the Jewish character of the state. There is no European position and agreement on that issue, and I'm afraid that there will not be a position, because Israel is a nation state, Israel is very much ideological, and the European Union is allegedly a post-national construct where they have already moved from the issue of those nations allegedly. So the fact that Israel described itself with that Jewish character presents a serious problem for some Europeans. I remember when I was trying and finally successfully convinced Chancellor Merkel, which was the only European leader that was willing to go as far as to articulate that as part of the German position vis-à-vis Israel, even within her own rank and file, a party which is on the face of it very supportive, the Christian Democrats, had a serious internal discussion whether to include Israel as a Jewish state within their platform. So what I will only want to suggest to you, beyond the difference that some of them are of a tactical nature, we have some structural problems that we should be cognizant of them. I will pick up only one other aspect because the ambassador has not touched upon this, which I see with growing concern, and it goes in a way hand in hand with the new anti-Semitism. I, by the way, do not belong to those who, whenever you hear Europeans or others criticize Israel, that I already lump them together as anti-Semites. Some of them are really expressing some genuine criticism which we should better listen to. And we cannot always, whenever there is criticism that goes beyond what we are willing to entertain, to simply paint it as anti-Semitism. But I am extremely concerned about, and I'm generalizing now, about the steady, slippery slope in terms of erosion of public opinion position towards Israel. And we all of us have to be concerned about it because at the end of the day, governments are looking for legitimacy for their own constituency in order to articulate and advocate their policies. And there is a growing gap between some of the pro-Israeli government who have an understanding for the state of Israel and its predicament, and the public opinion, which is kind of tending between indifference and negativism. I can only speak a bit more about Germany, where since the 1980s we see a steady erosion to the point that it will be a serious thing for any government in the future to stay the course, because you have to listen at the end of the day to what the constituency is telling you about Israel. And therefore, I think that the Israeli government doesn't do much about addressing public opinion. I went as long as to say that at the end of the day, the Israeli-European or the Israeli-German relationship are very much an elite project, which is not shared by the widespread majority of the electorate, and that's something which should be a source of concern to us.